Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this morning for our Sunday school lesson. Thank you all for being here in person, and good morning to anyone who's watching online. Our lesson today is from Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. But before we get started, I wanted to ask you a question. And have you ever been honored and it's been a surprise to you, or maybe you received some unexpected praise and you didn't feel really worthy of it? It may have caught you by surprise, or you may have done something that you thought was just part of your normal day-to-day business or life, and yet somebody honored you for it, and you felt like, well, I don't deserve that award, or I don't deserve that recognition. I didn't do anything more than, my peers or whatever. That can be a really surprising experience. It can be a very humbling experience if you go through something like that. And that sort of thing happens a little bit in today's lesson, where the centurion is who we're talking about, and the faith that he has and the unworthiness that he feels. And I think that each of us can identify him sometimes, with him sometimes, when he comes to Jesus desperate for help, but he didn't feel that he was worthy to actually even really visit with Jesus or be in his presence. And I think sometimes we don't feel worthy to ask for help from Jesus. And so think about that a little bit as we get into the scripture today, and as we get into the lesson of, how can we be better at that, and how can we be better about showing that to others, that Jesus wants to help us. We just have to ask for help sometimes. So the title of the lesson this week is Faith of a Centurion, and that's a continuation of this focus on faith we've had the entire quarter, really, of this book, of this lesson book. So we continue with that. I'll read the lesson together here, and then we'll break apart the different verses for you. Starting again, Luke 7, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So to give a little context to the lesson, I believe Jared talked about Capernaum last week and he was also in Luke, so it's kind of a continuation in that book. But it talks about how Capernaum was located on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, and that it does seem that was sort of a base of operations or headquarters for Jesus's preaching and teaching tours of Galilee. In fact, in some of the places in the Bible, it refers to it as Jesus's own town, so almost like where he chose to operate out of. And it's an important place in the Bible. It's mentioned at least 16 times in the New Testament. And it mentions that 5 of the disciples were from that area. So, it definitely was somewhere he spent time and chose people to follow him who were from that area. It said it didn't have more than a few hundred residents, but it was a thriving regional hub for at least 3 reasons. So it had a fishing industry that had steady income for all the families. In fact, it had so many fish that were caught there that they would preserve them with salt and send them to larger cities, so kind of a wholesale fishing industry, if you will. Second, it was situated on the main road from Damascus into the region, so it was a good place for the tax collectors to set up and take tolls on goods. And I couldn't help but think about the toll roads we have, in our state when I was reading about the tax collectors. I've never really associated those two things as far as tolls together, but maybe because I just got a bill for tolls in the mail from Raleigh for some recent travel. So it did make me think about the connection there of the tolls they were taking as people were traveling back and forth into these towns and these toll booths that they had set up. And then third, Capernaum was important enough to have had some soldiers stationed there, which is where the centurion comes into play. He's a Roman soldier. He's not a Jew who is living there right now and managing his team. So they say maybe the soldiers are there to safeguard the tax money that's collected, or possible there under Herod Antipas. But anyway, they're not really sure exactly why he's there, but that's a guess. So they did find several things from archaeological discoveries that have been made there. A lavish synagogue was found that dates to the time of Jesus, and or sat on a foundation floor from the time of Jesus. And they also found a large house that they feel like was Simon Peter's house, where Jesus actually stayed while he was in town. So definitely some critical things have been found there as well. So that's the setting for our lesson today. And then we'll break down the verses. So in verse 1, when Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. So we think at this point he's talking somewhere near the town, and obviously he moved around a lot during the time that he taught and preached. But they think that because they say he entered Capernaum, that he must have just been on the outskirts of it. He wasn't that far. It doesn't talk about him traveling a long way or anything. And then in verse 2, it says, there a centurion servant whom his master valued highly was sick and about to die. So a centurion was a captain who commanded 100 or so soldiers, usually 100, you think of century, 100. And it says it was part of a legion of the Roman army, and the legion had like 59 centuries organized in 10 cohorts. And it goes through all this to sort of add up how many troops were in the area, probably around 5,000 troops. But the centurion was obviously one of the more important and senior officials that were in that area at the time. So we know the centurion had servants. In the commentary, it talks some about how it wasn't uncommon at all for them to have slaves during that time, but these were slaves who eventually became freedmen most of the time, usually by the time they were 30 or so. A lot of times they were given their freedom. And this particular servant was highly valued. It says whom his master valued highly, was really sick, and they assumed he was going to die. So they don't go into detail about what's wrong with him exactly. They just know that he's on his deathbed at this point. So in verse 3, it says, the centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking to come and heal his servant. So this centurion, this Roman soldier, who's a Gentile, had heard about Jesus and all these things he'd been doing in the area, and believed and had the faith to send some of the elders of the Jews. And it says that this particular centurion had been really good to the church, which we'll get into here in just a minute about the synagogue. But he had given money, he had helped build the synagogue, so he had very much interacted with the people of faith of the Jews in this area. So he sends some elders of the Jews, and it talks about how he probably did that from a cultural perspective as well, maybe instead of him going himself, because he felt like maybe the Jews would have more pull with Jesus maybe than him going as a Roman soldier going to see him. But anyway, so he recognizes, he understands those issues of the culture at that time with Gentiles and Jews and what all went on with them, as y'all are familiar. And so in verses 4 to 5, it says, when they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. They were sincere. This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So they're, speaking on his behalf and saying that he is devoted to the area, he's devoted to their country, and built this church that I mentioned earlier, or the synagogue, or a place to worship. It means place of assembly in Greek. He's just trying to really explain why it was so important, and that he was a man of faith. It says that some students of this particular book believe the centurion was a Gentile in the category of one that feared God. So not someone necessarily who was a convert to Judaism but was devout, and his funding of the synagogue was more than public works. It was rooted in his deep respect for Judaism and the God that Judaism respects, or our God. So that was an interesting background on why he sent the people the way he did, and then why he's asking Jesus to heal his servant, who obviously he cares about, to go to this trouble for it. And before we continue with the lesson, there's a little insert story here in the commentary, and this is one that Jared can relate to because of the credit risk that he deals with all the time at work. But it talks about this person who's signing as a co-signer for his son to get a vehicle. And if you've ever had to co-sign with somebody on a loan, you know that's a little scary because you're depending on them to pay the loan back, and it's going to hurt your name if they don't do it. And also, you know, you have good credit, or that it wouldn't matter that you co-signed, right? So you want to take care of your credit. You don't want to take a chance and them mess up your credit and hurt your ability or your reputation to get things back. And you know, in the story, it talks about how, you know, this parent had such a good experience with that. The son did such a good job paying it back, and then was able to get credit on his own later. But he compares this to the Jews co-signing the centurion's request. I thought that was an interesting analogy there between those two things, that the Jews are vouching for this centurion, for this soldier who's a Gentile. You know, they're vouching that he's a good man and that he's a man of his word, and that he's earnest about caring for this servant. He's earnest about his faith and believing in Jesus as having this power, and believing in their God for helping build this synagogue and everything. And it mentions at the end of the little story a really good question for all of us. It says, it quotes Matthew 7:16, and says, Jesus said, "By their fruit you will recognize them. What fruits did you produce this past week that would cause others to vouch enthusiastically for your character?" Well, that was a really good thinking question for all of us. So we continue with the lesson here in verse 6. So Jesus went with them. So they came, they persuaded Jesus by their earnest request, and he goes with them to visit the centurion and the servant. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed." So the critical part of that, I mean, obviously he's very humble. He doesn't believe he deserves Jesus to even come to see him or to be in his presence. But he does believe. Say the word, and I know my servant will be healed. So he believes that without even being present with the servant or in their house, that Jesus has that power to heal him. So that's a really, really powerful sentence in the day's verse for us. And then in verse 8, he says, "For I am myself," he explains why he believes that Jesus has this power. He says, "For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." So he's given an example of, I know what it's like to have some power. I say, go, this one goes. I know that you are more powerful than that, and you have the ability to make this happen, whether you're present or not. It's just your word has the power, and you can heal this person. So it's truly an example, again, of his belief in Jesus' unlimited authority and his power over all things. So in verse 9, it says, "When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." And in the commentary, it says the four Gospels don't speak of Jesus being amazed at something very often, or someone. Usually people are amazed at him, you know, of what he's doing with the different examples. But it says the two exceptions where Jesus is amazed are the faith of the Gentile centurion, so today's lesson, and the lack of faith of people in Nazareth. So as far as having positive faith, this is the one example that we hear about. And so I thought that was really interesting, because the centurion story wasn't one that had jumped out at me in the past as far as some of the other things that Jesus has done. And maybe I hadn't read it as carefully as I had this week. I'm sure that's true. But it was really interesting to break it apart this way. It says, as far as Luke is concerned, the centurion's faith is the greatest miracle in this passage, that he would have this faith and yet not be part of, the chosen Jews or whatever. And ask a question in here: how can you demonstrate great faith in your neighborhood or your city or your country? How do we show that faith? In verse 10, then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So, Jesus did it. He did it in honor of this man's faith and because he could help him. It says that one interesting way of healing that's not often considered is miracle healing from a distance. And there's 3 examples of this where Jesus does it without being present with the people. One is the centurion servant in today's text. One is the Gentile woman's daughter in Matthew. And then the nobleman and his son in John. And in all the cases, faith was vindicated. So it's the person's faith in Jesus and his ability to heal that helped make that all happen. So as I was reading through this, and we're close to the conclusion now, I told you it wouldn't be a very long lesson this morning. I was thinking about the lies that we tell ourselves that prevent us from going to Jesus with our needs. The centurion believed. He had a desperate situation with the servant he cared about who was dying, and he knew he was dying. And he used his faith, but he also wasn't afraid to reach out, right? He could have been laughed at. He could have possibly been persecuted by some others within the Roman army. It doesn't say that, but we don't know. The other Gentiles may have looked down on him as a leader for doing this. But, do we allow ourselves to believe that Jesus cares about us as individuals when we have a need? We shouldn't be afraid to go to him. He does care. So hopefully our lesson today can help us and encourage us to ask for help as we need it, or even to ask for help for others, as many of you often do as we have prayer requests and things like that. In the conclusion here, it says, when we offer up intercessory prayer for the healing of a friend or family member, are we exercising the same faith of the centurion? Without a doubt, any forthcoming healing will be a remote healing since Jesus is not here in the flesh, so that's not the issue. The issue instead is one of believing in Jesus' authority. That's the essence of what we might call centurion faith. Our intercessory prayers must have more than a maybe or a hope so. When we fix our eyes on Jesus, we demonstrate centurion faith that God will answer our prayers. When we're distracted from him and wringing our hands in despair, nothing good happens. Jesus taught, if you believe, you'll receive what you ask for in prayer. So we have to focus on his ability and his power when we're praying for those things, and not let worry consume us. That's so easy as humans to do, but we have to believe in what we're asking for. The centurion's background speaks loudly. He had cultivated friendships within his community for years. He had treated his neighbors with respect and honor, not pulling his rank as a Roman officer to get his way. In many ways, the significant gap between the Jews and Gentiles of Jesus' day was bridged on that day in Capernaum. The centurion had used his wealth and influence to protect the Jews and provide a gathering place for their study of Scripture. He played the long game in the most sincere and authentic manner possible. When his household was in need, his character and his actions were remembered. Can the same be said of ours? It's a good question today for us to remember as we go out. And one of the final questions is, how will you have the centurion faith in situations when it seems that God doesn't answer your prayers in a preferred or expected ways? What about in situations where it doesn't seem that God's answering quick enough or at all, and maybe the answer is just not what we want to hear? We still need to believe that he has the power to answer that prayer. It just may not be the way that we want him to or the way that we think it should be. So this week as you go out, I encourage you all to have centurion faith, to remember to play the long game. I was thinking back to that example of the co-signing for the credit. That's how you build good credit worthiness, right, is playing the long game, paying your bills, paying loans back on time, and all that builds credit. It's not a quick thing. It takes time to build it, although you can lose it pretty quickly. Just like the centurion, we need to play this long game and be sincere and authentic in the way that we help people. One of the other questions in the commentary that I also wanted to leave you with is, how can you use the positions of leadership in which God has placed you to worship and serve Him? So as we have great faith, as we demonstrate that, how can we demonstrate that every day in how we lead others or how we work with others? We all have that opportunity in some form or fashion, whether it's within our families or within our work world or within our church families. But how do we show that every day? How do we show our centurion faith? So that's my challenge to everyone this week. I hope you all have a good week. I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions before we wrap up. Thank you all for your time.